What if your parents bet everything on your siblings' future, only to beg for a piece of your $40 million empire when their gamble failed? Avery Quinn faced betrayal, heartbreak, and a secret letter from her late father that turned her world upside down, all while building a tech dynasty from nothing. Want to know how she turned pain into power? Hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers to uncover the shocking truth behind her rise. The letter in my hand felt heavier than it should have. It was my acceptance letter from Stanford University, a golden ticket to the future I'd spent years dreaming of, working for, fighting for. But instead of celebration, I stood frozen in our cramped Sacramento dining room, the air thick with tension and unspoken resentment. My mother, Lillian Quinn, sat across from me at the scratched wooden table, her face drawn and tired, her voice carrying a finality I'd learned to dread. "Avery, we've been over this," she said, her tone clipped, as if she were reciting lines from a script she'd rehearsed 100 times. "Madison needs the support more. Medical school isn't cheap, and her career, it's a guaranteed path. We can't risk everything on something as unstable as tech." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady, but my hands trembled as I clutched the letter tighter. "Mom, I got a scholarship that covers half the tuition," I said, fighting the lump in my throat. "My grades are better than Madison's were when you paid for her to go to UCLA. I've won coding competitions. I aced the SAT math section." "Doesn't that count for something?" My mother sighed, her eyes flickering to the stack of papers on the table between us. I knew what they were before she even opened her mouth: medical bills. A towering pile of debt from my father's emergency heart surgery 6 months ago. Dr. Ethan Quinn, once the pillar of our family, had nearly died on the operating table, ironic for a renowned cardiologist, and the cost of saving him had drained every penny of savings we had. But then I saw something else in the pile, something that made my stomach twist. Beneath the hospital invoices was a receipt for a $5,000 MCAT prep course for Madison, dated just last month. I pointed at it, my voice rising despite myself. "What's this? You said we had no money left, but you paid for her extra classes. Why does she get everything while I'm supposed to settle for community college?" My mother's face hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Avery, don't make this harder than it already is," she snapped. "The family is on the edge as it is. Your father's recovery, Madison's education, it's all too much. You can start at community college and transfer later. It's the practical choice." Practical, that word again. It was the same excuse they'd used every time my dreams clashed with their vision of success. My father, still frail from his surgery, sat silently at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't said a word since the conversation started, but his silence spoke louder than any argument could. He'd always been the softer one, the one I thought might understand, but even he wouldn't meet my gaze now. "Dad," I said quietly, my voice breaking, "you've been saying tech jobs are unstable for years, but the industry keeps growing. I could make something of myself at Stanford. Why can't you believe in me the way you believe in Madison?" He sighed, a heavy rattling sound that made me wince. "Avery, it's not about belief," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's about what's best for the family. Madison's on a path to save lives, just like I did. We can't sink ourselves financially when her education is already stretching us thin." I stared at him, the man who taught me to dream big, who'd once told me I could be anything I wanted. Now he was telling me my dreams were expendable, a risk not worth taking. The ache in my chest sharpened into something raw, something I didn't have a name for yet. I looked down at the Stanford letter again, its crisp edges crumpling under my grip. I'd worked so hard for this, late nights studying, weekends coding in the school library, summers fixing computers at the local electronics store to save for a laptop of my own. All of it had led to this moment, and now it felt like it was slipping through my fingers. "I just want the same chance Madison got," I said, my voice barely audible. "The chance to go to a top school without working myself to death. The support of the two people who are supposed to believe in me no matter what." My mother reached across the table, her hand resting on mine in a gesture that might have been comforting if it didn't feel so hollow. We're not saying, don't go to college, Avery, she said, her tone softening but still firm. There's the community college right here in Sacramento. You can transfer to a state school after 2 years. That's the sensible path for someone like you. Someone like me, as if my 4 GPA, my state-level programming awards, my perfect SAT math score were somehow less than Madison's B+ average and her single-minded determination to become a doctor like our father. I pulled my hand away, the rejection stinging more than I expected. It wasn't just about the money, not really. It was about where I stood in their hierarchy of potential. Second place, the backup child, the one expected to settle for less because my dreams didn't fit their narrow definition of success. Madison's path to medicine was a straight line, a safe bet. My path to Silicon Valley? A gamble they weren't willing to take. That night, I sat alone in my tiny bedroom, the Stanford letter spread out on my bed alongside rejection letters from scholarships I hadn't won. The math was brutal. Even with the partial scholarship, I'd need to work nearly full-time to afford the rest of the tuition, housing, and books. It seemed impossible, but as I stared at the ceiling, a fire ignited inside me. If they wouldn't believe in me, I'd believe in myself enough for all of us. I didn't know how I'd make it work, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let their doubts define my future. As I packed my worn-out backpack with the few things I owned, I made a silent vow. I'd go to Stanford with or without their help. I'd prove them wrong, not for their sake, but for mine. And one day, they'd see what I was capable of, even if it took everything I had to show them. Looking back, I think I always knew my place in the Quinn family ecosystem even before I had the words to describe it. Growing up in Sacramento, our house was a shrine to ambition, at least the kind my parents understood. My father, Dr. Ethan Quinn, had built a legacy as a cardiologist, the kind of man who saved lives and carried the weight of his immigrant parents' sacrifices on his shoulders. My mother, Lillian, had once been a high school teacher, but she gave up her career to raise us and support Dad's rise in the medical world. Their story was one of grit and triumph, the kind they loved to remind us of at every family dinner. But while their sacrifices paved the way for Madison to follow in Dad's footsteps, they seemed to cast a shadow over me, dimming any light I tried to shine on my own path. Madison and I were opposites from the start, two sides of a coin that never quite fit together. At 5 years old, she'd parade around the house with a toy stethoscope around her neck, pretending to check my heartbeat while I sat cross-legged on the floor, dismantling old radios with a screwdriver I'd stolen from Dad's toolbox. By the time we were teenagers, the divide was even clearer. Madison joined the Future Doctors Club at school and shadowed Dad at the hospital, earning glowing praise from everyone she met. I taught myself Python from library books and built my first computer from salvaged parts, but my achievements were met with polite nods at best. When Madison won a science fair in 8th grade, Mom threw a big dinner to celebrate. And when I took first place in a statewide coding competition 2 years later, Dad clapped me on the shoulder and said, "That's nice, Avery, keep it up." It wasn't jealousy that gnawed at me, not really. It was the unspoken assumption that her dreams were worth more than mine, that her path was inherently more valuable. There were signs I should have seen earlier, red flags I ignored because I wanted so badly to believe things would change. When I needed a new laptop for a high school coding project, Mom told me to earn the money myself. Babysit, mow lawns, whatever it took. Meanwhile, Madison's MCAT prep course, twice as expensive as the laptop I needed, was covered without a second thought. "Your sister needs this for her applications," Dad explained when I asked why. Medical school is incredibly competitive, as if Stanford's 4% acceptance rate wasn't competitive, as if my dreams didn't deserve the same kind of investment. Still, I held on to hope, telling myself that once I proved myself, once I showed them tech wasn't a fad but a future, they'd see me differently. But there was something else, something darker that shaped the way Mom treated me, something I didn't fully understand until years later. When I was 14, a car accident changed everything. Mom was driving Madison to an extra biology class. She'd insisted on it, even though it was pouring rain that day. A truck ran a red light and slammed into their car. Madison broke her leg and had to sit out her freshman year sports season, but Mom's injuries were worse. A mild traumatic brain injury that left her with migraines and a lingering fog she never quite shook off. Physically, she recovered, but emotionally, she was never the same. After the accident, she became obsessed with Madison's success, like it was her penance for what happened. Every spare dollar, every ounce of energy went to ensuring Madison didn't fall behind. And me? I became an afterthought, a footnote in her mission to redeem herself through my sister's achievements. I don't think Mom meant to push me away, not consciously at least, but the way she looked at me after that accident, like I was speaking a language she couldn't understand, cut deeper than any words could. You should think about something more stable, she'd say whenever I brought up tech, her voice tinged with worry. Computers are fine as a hobby, but medicine, that's a real career. I'd nod and smile, pretending it didn't hurt, but inside I was screaming. Why couldn't she see me the way she saw Madison? Why couldn't she believe in me just as much? It wasn't all bad, though. There were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, that kept me tethered to hope. One night when I was 16, I found an old letter I'd written to Mom tucked away in a drawer. It was from a middle school project where we had to write to someone we admired. I'd chosen her, pouring my heart onto the page about how grateful I was for her support, how I knew she believed in me, even when I doubted myself. Reading it years later, I realized it was a lie I'd told myself to feel better. She'd never said those things, never given me the kind of encouragement I craved, but I had wanted so badly to believe it that I'd convinced myself it was true. I folded the letter carefully and put it back, a bitter taste in my mouth. Maybe I'd been naive to think a piece of paper could bridge the gap between us. Still, I didn't resent Madison. Not really. She worked hard, and her dream of becoming a neurosurgeon was as real as mine of revolutionizing tech. We'd had our moments of closeness, like the time we stayed up all night studying for her organic chemistry exam, me quizzing her on flashcards while we laughed over cold pizza. But even then, there was an unspoken distance between us, a line drawn by our parents' expectations. She was the golden child, the one they pinned their hopes on. I was the practical one, the one who'd figure things out on her own, because that's what I'd always done. By the time I got that Stanford letter, I'd spent years building a fortress around my dreams, brick by brick, hoping one day it'd be strong enough to withstand their doubts. But that night, in the dining room, as Mom's words echoed in my ears and Dad's silence pressed down on me like a weight, I felt those bricks start to crumble. I went back to my room and spread out my college acceptance letters on the bed. Stanford, MIT, Caltech. All schools I now couldn't afford without working myself into the ground. The numbers didn't add up, no matter how I crunched them. But as I stared at the ceiling, a new kind of clarity settled over me. If I wanted this, I'd have to fight for it harder than I'd ever fought for anything. Not because they'd finally see my worth, but because I knew it myself. I wasn't going to let their limited vision of success define mine. I'd go to Stanford. I'd make it work, and I'd show the world what I was capable of, even if I had to do it alone. Leaving home for Stanford was like stepping off a cliff with no safety net beneath me. I'd packed my entire life into a single battered suitcase, the weight of my parents' doubts heavier than any luggage I could carry. The partial scholarship I'd earned covered half of my tuition, but the rest, housing, books, food, was on me. I'd crunched the numbers 1,000 times, and the reality was brutal. I'd need to work nearly full-time while taking a maximum course load to make it through. It wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore, it was about survival. As I boarded the plane to Palo Alto with a one-way ticket I'd paid for with my savings from the electronics store job, I felt the fire in my chest burn brighter. I wasn't just Avery Quinn, the overlooked daughter. I was Avery Quinn, the girl who'd make it happen, no matter what. The first semester at Stanford was a blur of exhaustion and determination. I juggled 3 jobs to keep my head above water. Morning shifts at a campus coffee shop where I'd plaster on a smile while serving espresso to bleary-eyed students. Afternoon hours in the IT department, troubleshooting printers and resetting passwords for professors. And late-night freelance coding gigs, building websites for local businesses. Until my eyes burned from staring at the screen. I lived on instant ramen and black coffee, my dorm room a mess of empty noodle cups and textbooks. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. 4 hours a night if I was lucky. I'd set alarms to wake myself up at 3 a.m. to finish assignments, my body running on sheer willpower. But somehow, against all odds, I made the dean's list that first semester. When I got the email confirming it, I sat alone in my dorm, staring at the screen with tears in my eyes. It was a small victory, but it felt like a mountain I'd climbed with my bare hands. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. One winter night, as I sat in the library cramming for a midterm, my phone buzzed with a call from Madison. Her voice was shaky, barely audible over the static of the poor connection. "Avery, it's Mom," she said, and my heart dropped into my stomach. "She's in the hospital. They think it's severe exhaustion, maybe depression. It's bad." I gripped the edge of the table, my vision blurring as panic set in. Mom had been different since the car accident all those years ago, her mood swinging between detachment and obsession with Madison's success, but I hadn't realized how much she'd been struggling. "Is she going to be okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Madison hesitated, and that pause told me more than her words could. "She's stable for now," she said finally. But she's not herself. I wanted to drop everything and go home, to sit by Mom's side and hold her hand like I used to when I was little. But the reality hit me like a punch. I couldn't afford the plane ticket. Every penny I'd earned was tied up in tuition and rent, and I didn't have a single credit card to my name. All I could do was stay on the phone, listening to Madison describe the sterile hospital room, the way Mom clutched an old letter I'd written her years ago, a letter I barely remembered writing, full of words I'd wished were true. "She keeps asking for you," Madison said, her voice breaking. "But she doesn't even know what day it is." I hung up and sat there in the empty library, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. That night, I cried myself to sleep, the sound of laughter from a nearby dorm party echoing through the walls like a cruel reminder of how alone I was. The guilt gnawed at me for weeks. Should I have gone home anyway, taken out another loan, found a way? But deep down, I knew I couldn't. If I left now, I might never come back. Stanford was my shot, my one chance to break free of the box my parents had tried to trap me in. So I stayed, burying myself in work and studies, trying to outrun the ache in my chest. But life, it seemed, had more challenges in store. By my 3rd year, I'd found a fragile rhythm. Still overworked, still underslept, but managing to keep my grades up and my bills paid. That's when I got a chance that felt like a lifeline, a national AI competition with a $100,000 prize, enough to pay off my student loans and give me a cushion to breathe. I poured everything into my project, a predictive algorithm for detecting system failures in manufacturing plants. It was my best work yet, the kind of thing I knew could make a difference. I teamed up with a few classmates I trusted, or thought I did, working late nights in the lab to perfect our submission. The night before the deadline, I stayed up until 4 a.m. polishing the final code, my eyes gritty with fatigue. I uploaded our draft to the shared drive and collapsed into bed, trusting my team to handle the submission, while I caught a few hours of sleep. But when I woke up, something felt off. My teammate Jake, the one I'd considered a friend, was avoiding my texts. When I checked the competition portal later that day, my stomach dropped. Our project had been submitted, under Jake's name alone. He'd stripped my contributions out, claiming full credit for himself. I confronted him in the lab that evening, my voice shaking with rage. "How could you do this?" I demanded. "We built that together. My algorithms are the backbone of it." He smirked, leaning back in his chair like he didn't have a care in the world. "Look, Avery, this isn't personal. I need the money more than you do. You'll figure something out. You always do." I felt like I'd been slapped. There was no time to appeal to the competition organizers, no proof I could point to since we'd worked on a shared system. I'd been betrayed by someone I trusted, and the prize I'd been counting on slipped through my fingers. For a moment, I thought about giving up, not just on the competition, but on everything. What was the point of fighting so hard when the world kept kicking me down? But then I thought of Mom in that hospital bed, of the letter she'd held onto, of the promise I'd made to myself when I left Sacramento. I wasn't going to let Jake or anyone else take this from me. So I started over. With only a week left before another smaller competition's deadline, I rebuilt the project from scratch, improving it where I could. I barely slept, barely ate, fueled by a mix of fury and desperation. When I submitted it, I didn't expect much, just a chance to salvage something from the wreckage. But a month later, I got the email, second place, $20,000. It wasn't the jackpot I'd hoped for, but it was enough to keep me afloat for another semester. More than that, it was proof that I could rise above even the worst betrayals. As I deposited the prize money into my account, I sat on my dorm bed staring at a photo of my family, the only one I'd brought with me, taken during a rare trip to the beach years ago. Mom was laughing in the picture, her arm around me, her eyes bright with a joy I hadn't seen since the accident. I traced her face with my finger and whispered to myself, "I'm not done yet. Not even close." The scars from Jake's betrayal lingered, but they taught me something valuable. In a world that didn't always play fair, I had to be tougher, sharper, more relentless than anyone else. By my junior year at Stanford, I'd carved out a fragile stability, still overworked, still underslept, but I'd learned to navigate the chaos. I'd reduced my jobs to 2. Assistant by day, freelance coder by night, and I'd started working as a research assistant for Professor Eleanor Hayes, a brilliant AI pioneer whose mentorship was worth more than any paycheck. The extra income from her project helped me cut back on instant ramen, even if it meant trading sleep for late-night coding sessions. I was surviving, maybe even thriving, when the second blow came. A loss so sudden it nearly broke me. It was a rainy morning in March when my phone rang, Madison's name flashing on the screen. I was in the middle of debugging a neural network for Professor Hayes, my laptop balanced on my knees in the cramped dorm room. I almost didn't answer. I had a deadline looming, but something in my gut told me to pick up. "Avery," Madison said, her voice raw and trembling, "it's Dad. He had a stroke last night. He didn't make it." The words hit me like a freight train, knocking the air from my lungs. I sat there, frozen, the hum of my laptop fan the only sound in the room. "What do you mean, he didn't make it?" I whispered, as if saying it out loud could undo the truth. Madison's sobs crackled through the line. "He was gone before the ambulance got there. I'm so sorry, Avery. I didn't know how to tell you." I don't remember hanging up the phone or packing a bag, but somehow I found myself on a Greyhound bus back to Sacramento, the cheapest ticket I could afford. The funeral was a blur of gray skies and murmured condolences, relatives I hadn't seen in years patting my shoulder as I stood beside Mom and Madison. Mom looked like a ghost of herself, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling as she clutched a photo of Dad from their wedding day. Madison held herself together better, but I could see the cracks. Her shoulders hunched, her lips pressed tight to keep from crying. I felt like I was underwater, every word and gesture reaching me through a thick, suffocating haze. I hadn't seen Dad in person since I left for Stanford, hadn't had a real conversation with him since that night in the dining room when he told me my dreams weren't worth the risk. Now I never would. After the service, while Mom and Madison spoke with the pastor, I slipped into Dad's study, the one room in the house that still felt like him. His desk was cluttered with medical journals and prescription pads, but tucked into a drawer, I found something that stopped me cold. A letter, written in his meticulous handwriting, addressed to me. My hands shook as I unfolded it, the paper creased from being handled too many times. "Avery," I began. "I've been meaning to say this for a long time, but I never found the courage. I'm proud of you. So proud. I know I didn't show it, didn't support you the way I should have. I thought I was protecting Madison, thought she needed me more because her path was harder, but I was wrong. You're my light, always have been. Forgive me for not saying it sooner." The words blurred as tears streamed down my face. I clutched the letter to my chest, sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. He'd seen me, he'd believed in me, but he'd kept it to himself until it was too late. That letter broke something inside me, but it also forced me to confront a choice. Mom was still fragile from her hospital stay the year before, and Madison was struggling to keep up with her medical school workload. Part of me wanted to stay in Sacramento to help them through this, to be the daughter they needed now that Dad was gone. But another part, the part that had fought tooth and nail to get to Stanford, knew I couldn't. If I stayed, I'd be giving up everything I'd worked for, everything Dad had finally admitted he admired. So I made a promise to myself, standing in his study with his letter in my hand. I'd keep going, not just for me, but for him. I'd make him proud, even if he couldn't see it. I returned to Stanford a week later, carrying the weight of grief like a stone in my chest. But life didn't pause for mourning. Barely a month after the funeral, I got an email from Dr. Vikram Sharma, a former student of Professor Hayes, who'd founded a rising AI startup in San Francisco. He'd heard about my work through the professor and wanted to offer me a summer internship. The pay was enough to let me quit my IT job for 3 months, and the opportunity to work alongside some of the brightest minds in tech was a dream come true. I threw myself into the internship with everything I had, determined to honor Dad's memory by proving I could succeed on my own terms. My project was a predictive model for supply chain optimization, and I poured my grief, my anger, my hope into every line of code. But just as I was finding my footing, another storm hit. 2 months into the internship, a rival company accused Dr. Sharma's startup of stealing proprietary data, claiming my supply chain algorithm was built on their tech. The accusation came out of nowhere, and I was called into a tense meeting with the company's legal team. "We need all your project files, Avery," the lead lawyer said, his tone cold. "If there's any truth to this, it could sink us, and you." My heart pounded as I sat there, the room closing in around me. I knew I hadn't stolen anything. Every piece of that algorithm was mine, built from scratch. But the fear of losing everything I'd worked for was suffocating. For a moment, I saw my entire future crumbling. The internship, my reputation, the fragile stability I'd fought so hard to build. Then I remembered something. A digital watermark I'd embedded in my code as a precaution after Jake's betrayal. It was a unique identifier, a fingerprint that proved the work was mine. I spent a sleepless night pulling up every commit, every draft, until I had a timeline that showed my algorithm's evolution from day one. The next morning, I presented it to Dr. Sharma and the legal team, my hands trembling as I walked them through the evidence. "This is my work," I said, my voice steady despite the exhaustion. "I can prove it." Dr. Sharma's expression softened, and after a long silence, he nodded. "You've done more than prove it, Avery. You've saved us." They used my evidence to countersue the rival company, and the scandal that could have ended my career became the moment that cemented my place in Dr. Sharma's team. A few weeks later, on my last day of the internship, Dr. Sharma called me into his office. "We'd like to offer you a full-time position after graduation," he said, sliding a contract across the desk. The salary he named was more than I'd ever imagined earning straight out of college. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt a flicker of hope, a real, tangible path forward. I signed the contract with a steady hand, thinking of the letter still tucked in my bag. "I'm doing this for you, Dad," I whispered to myself as I left the office, the San Francisco skyline stretching out before me like a promise. 10 years had passed since I left Sacramento with a battered suitcase and a vow to prove myself. And now I stood in a corner office on the 30th floor of a gleaming San Francisco high-rise, staring at an email that felt like a dream. The subject line read, "Takata Industries Series C funding confirmation." My company, Quantum Flow AI, had just closed a $40 million funding round, led by a Japanese manufacturing giant that believed in my vision, a vision that had once been dismissed as impractical by the two people whose approval I'd craved most. Um, the deal valued Quantum Flow at $300 million, a number that still didn't feel real. I'd gone from a girl scraping by on ramen and 4 hours of sleep to the CEO of one of the fastest growing AI startups in the country. Our team had swelled to 60 employees. Our client list spanned 3 continents. And my name, Avery Quinn, was starting to mean something in Silicon Valley. I should have been celebrating, popping champagne with my team, but instead I sat alone at my desk, the city skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The truth was, success didn't erase the ache I'd carried all those years. Every milestone, the first patent, the first client, the first million in revenue, had been bittersweet, a reminder of the battles I'd fought without the support of the family I'd once lived to impress. I glanced at the framed photo on my desk, the one from that beach trip years ago, where Mom's laughter lit up her face and Dad's arm rested around my shoulders. It was the only piece of home I'd brought into this new life, a tether to a past I couldn't quite let go of. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the glass door. My assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Miss Quinn, your mother and sister are here to see you." I froze, my hand tightening around the edge of my desk. I hadn't invited them. We spoke on holidays, stiff, polite conversations about the weather or Madison's latest job, but they'd never visited my office before. Curiosity outweighed my hesitation, and I nodded to let them in. The door swung open, and there they were. Mom, looking older than I remembered, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, and Madison, her posture stiff, her eyes darting around the room like she was sizing it up. Mom moved first, crossing the room in a few quick steps to pull me into a hug that caught me off guard. Her arms trembled around me, and when she pulled back, her eyes were wet with tears. "Avery," she said, her voice breaking, "we saw the article in the Wall Street Journal. $40 million. Why didn't you tell us?" I forced a smile, gesturing for them to sit on the sleek leather couch by the window. "It's been a busy time," I said simply, avoiding the real answer, that I hadn't told them because I wasn't sure they'd care unless there was something in it for them. Madison spoke next, her tone softer than I expected. "You've done really well for yourself, Avery. I mean, this place, it's incredible." There was a flicker of sincerity in her words, but also something else, an undercurrent of envy I couldn't ignore. Mom nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "We're so proud of you, honey," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We always knew you had it in you." The words landed like a punch, hollow and late. Always knew? They'd never known. They'd dismissed my dreams, pushed me to the sidelines, left me to fend for myself while they poured everything into Madison. I wanted to believe her, wanted to feel the warmth of her pride, but it felt foreign, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. Then came the real reason for their visit. Mom cleared her throat, her eyes darting to Madison before settling back on me. "We've been thinking," she began, her tone careful, "about our future, with retirement coming up and with opportunities like this so rare, well, we wondered if there might be room for a family investment in Quantum Flow." There it was. The truth I'd suspected but hoped I was wrong about. They weren't here to celebrate me. They were here because they needed something. Madison shifted uncomfortably, adding, "Things have been tough lately. I dropped out of med school last year. The pressure, the hours, it was too much. We've been struggling to pay off some debts." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of their words settling over me like a fog. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind them of every sleepless night, every dollar I'd scraped together while they funded Madison's path without a second thought. But another part, the part that still loved them despite everything, saw the exhaustion in Mom's eyes, the defeat in Madison's slump. I took a deep breath and stood, motioning for them to follow me. "Let me show you something," I said, leading them out of my office and down a long hallway lined with framed displays. Each frame told a piece of Quantum Flow's story, and mine. The first held my Stanford acceptance letter alongside a cup of instant ramen preserved in resin, a reminder of the days I'd lived on nothing but determination. This is where it started, I said, my voice steady. 3 jobs, 4 hours of sleep a night, and noodles for every meal. We moved to the next display. My first algorithm patent, rejection letters from early investors, a photo of our original team in a cramped Oakland warehouse. Every milestone was a fight, I continued, watching their expressions shift from curiosity to discomfort. Every step required sacrifice and people who believed in me when no one else did. The final frame held the Takata Industries contract and a photo of our current leadership team. Brilliant minds who joined Quantum Flow when it was still a risky bet. I stopped there, turning to face them. Our investment policy is specific, I said, my tone firm but not unkind. We only bring in partners who showed faith in us during the hard early days, people who saw potential when others didn't. Mom's face fell and Madison looked away, her jaw tight. But we're family, Avery, Mom said softly, her voice pleading. Doesn't that count for something? It does, I agreed, pulling a brochure from my pocket and handing it to her. That's why I started this. The brochure was for the Ethan Quinn Foundation, a scholarship fund I'd established to support promising STEM students who lacked family support. Students like me at 18, full of potential, but told their dreams weren't worth the investment. Every year we fund 20 kids who remind me of myself back then, I explained. They need someone to believe in them. That's the lesson I learned from you. Maybe not the one you meant to teach, but the one I needed to learn. Mom's eyes filled with tears again, and this time she didn't try to stop them. She clutched the brochure to her chest and pulled me into another hug, her sobs shaking her frail frame. I was wrong, Avery, she whispered against my shoulder. I didn't see you, not the way I should have. I'm so sorry. Madison stood silently, her arms crossed. But I could see the guilt in her eyes, the realization of how much she'd taken for granted. Oh, I didn't know if I could fully forgive them, not yet. But in that moment, a small piece of the resentment I'd carried for so long began to dissolve. Not because they'd earned it, but because I'd earned the right to let it go. As they left, subdued and thoughtful, I returned to my office and sat down at my desk. There was one last thing I'd done for them, something I didn't tell them about. A discreet transfer from my personal account to theirs, enough to cover the debts Madison had mentioned. I wasn't ready to let them back into my life fully, but I couldn't let them drown either, not after everything we'd been through. Maybe it was weakness, maybe it was kindness. I wasn't sure, and I didn't care to decide just then. I opened my laptop, and a new email caught my eye, a message from a student who'd received a scholarship from the Ethan Quinn Foundation. Her name was Sophia, a first-generation college student who'd just been accepted to MIT thanks to the funding we provided. Dear Miss Quinn, she wrote, I never thought I'd get this chance. My parents told me school wasn't for people like us, but your foundation believed in me. I promise I'll make you proud. I smiled, tears welling up as I read her words. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. I stood and walked to the window, the San Francisco skyline glowing gold in the fading light of the sunset. I did it, Dad, I whispered, my voice steady. I hope you're smiling up there. The city stretched out before me, a testament to everything I'd built, not just a company, but a legacy. A legacy of resilience, of belief, of hope. And as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. Just the beginning of a new chapter, one I'd write on my own terms.